The hand appeared first. It pressed against the rear window of a small log cabin on a February night so cold that the glass had stopped being transparent and become something closer to stone. The hand was large, a man's hand, the knuckles split open and blackened at the tips, the fingers moving in a slow and rhythmic knock that had nothing of urgency left in it. It was the knocking of a man who had already spent everything he had just to reach the door, and whatever strength remained was only enough for this. One knock, a pause, another, slower than the last. Inside the cabin, a woman sat reading by the light of a single oil lamp. The room around her was dark and dropping fast toward freezing. She had been listening to the wind for 3 days. She knew the difference between wind and something else. She set the book down on her knee and looked up at the ceiling as if she could see through the timber joists and the accumulated snow above to whatever was making that sound. She could not see it, but she knew what it was. She stood up. The narrator's voice when it comes is not dramatic. It is the voice of someone who has had a long time to think about what happened and has arrived finally at a kind of plain-spoken reckoning. 6 months before that man knocked on her window, he had stood on the other side of a fence and called her a lunatic. Tonight he was dying on her doorstep, and she was the only reason he still had a chance. Flashback, April 1885. Hazel Voss arrived in Millhaven on a Tuesday morning in early April when the last of the winter snowpack was pulling away from the lower slopes and the ground was showing through in patches the color of old tobacco. She came in a hired wagon with 2 trunks of belongings and a crate of books wrapped in oilcloth, and she paid the driver without conversation and stood in front of the cabin on Blackwood Road and looked at it the way a doctor looks at a patient who has been neglected but not yet lost. She was 42 years old. Her hair was brown going gray at the temples, worn in a practical braid that she had been doing herself since she was 12. Her hands were the most honest part of her. They were the hands of someone who had spent 15 years doing work that most people did not survive long enough to learn. The knuckles were thick, the palms were calloused in specific places from the grip of a rope, from the handle of an ice axe, from the particular friction of a leather bridle held for hours in sub-zero air. A man named Colonel Hewitt, who had commanded the Wyoming garrison she had worked out of for 11 years, once told a new officer that the woman who would be guiding their winter supply convoy had forgotten more about cold weather survival than any of them would ever know. He had not been flattering her, he had been warning them. She had left that work the previous autumn, not because she could no longer do it, because 15 years of leading other people through danger had left her with a deep and quiet need to build something that was only hers, something she did not have to hand back at the end of the season. The cabin on Blackwood Road was a log structure from the early 1860s, set on a slight rise at the north edge of town. The price was low for reasons that became apparent quickly. The foundation was nothing more than dry stacked fieldstone with gaps wide enough to push a fist through. Beneath the floorboards was an unimproved crawl space open to the ground, cold and damp, and smelling of mineral earth and old rot. The roof had been repaired at least twice with mismatched materials. The window frames had worked themselves loose from the logs around them. In a hard winter, the structure would breathe cold air like a living thing, pulling it in through every gap and crack and joint. Hazel walked the perimeter of the cabin with her knuckles against the exterior logs, rapping at intervals and tilting her head to listen to what came back. It was a method she had learned from an old Shoshone guide named Francis Two Clouds, who had told her that every structure had a voice, and the voice told you where it was honest and where it was pretending. She finished her circuit, came back to the front, and stood for a moment with her hands in her pockets. Then she went inside, unfolded a piece of paper from her coat, and smoothed it on the kitchen table. The first line read, "Dig the dugout beneath the storage room, complete before October." She started in May after the ground thawed enough to work. The plan had come from the homesteader journal she had been collecting for a decade. Not one journal, but dozens, written by men and women who had survived the northern plains and the mountain territories in the decades before any of the conveniences that the newer settlers took as their natural inheritance. She had read about earthen dugouts the way a student reads about a theorem carefully and with a pencil in her hand, and she had arrived at her own version through a process of elimination and common sense. The dugout would be dug beneath the existing storage room floor accessed by a trapdoor in the boards. The walls would be supported by cedar posts and lined with a vapor barrier of overlapping canvas treated with linseed oil. The floor would be packed clay, tamped down hard. At the center of the room, she would install a small cast-iron parlor stove, the kind designed for low-ceiling spaces with a flue pipe that would angle up through the old stone chimney above. Along the rear wall, she would stack firewood, seasoned white oak and ash split and stacked no later than April to give it 6 months of drying before winter came. The earth itself was part of the design. At a depth of 6 to 8 feet in this part of Montana territory, the ground maintained a temperature of roughly 45 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what happened above it. That fact, recorded in journals going back to the 1840s, meant that the walls of the dugout would radiate a baseline warmth even before the stove was lit. It was not a comfortable warmth, but it was the difference between dying and not dying, which in Hazel's experience was the only measurement that mattered when things went genuinely wrong. She did not explain any of this to her neighbors. She simply began. The displaced earth she hauled out in a wheelbarrow and used to build terraced garden beds along the south-facing slope below the cabin. By the end of May, the beds were planted. By mid-June, the hole beneath the storage room was 4 feet deep and the cedar posts were in. By July, the walls were lined and the floor was tamped smooth, and she was beginning to think about the stove. The house next door had been empty when she arrived. It was not empty by June. Cornelius Aldgate came to Millhaven the same way money always came to the frontier, ahead of itself, with plans made in offices that had never seen the territory they were planning. He was 48 years old, heavy in the shoulders and heavy in the jaw, with the particular confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything for long enough to mistake luck for intelligence. He had come from St. Louis, where he had made a substantial sum in commercial real estate, and he had bought 3 parcels of land in Montana Territory in the previous year on the conviction that the Northern Pacific Railroad would double land values within 3 years. He was probably right about that. It was the only kind of right he knew how to be. The house he built on Blackwood Road was the finest structure in that part of Millhaven. 2 full stories. Oregon fir joists, Chicago plate glass in the windows, plaster walls smooth enough to hang wallpaper. In the basement, he had installed a hot air furnace, a central heating system that circulated warm air through iron pipes to registers in the floors of each room above. The installation had required a crew of 4 men brought up from Denver at considerable expense. Cornelius mentioned this expense often enough that everyone in the surrounding neighborhood knew the exact figure. The furnace had cost $500. He considered this proof of civilization. His wife Dorothea was 44, with the composed and watchful manner of a woman who had learned that composure was the most useful tool available to her. She wrote a regular column for the Philadelphia Ladies Gazette, a publication with a substantial readership among educated women on the Eastern Seaboard. The column was called The Frontier Parlor, and its premise was that the modern woman of refinement could maintain the standards of civilized living even at the edge of the wilderness. She was at the time of their arrival in Millhaven, midway through a piece about their new home working total civilized comforts at the edge of everything. She saw Hazel Voss for the first time through the kitchen window of her new house 1 week after they had moved in. Hazel was in her yard with a wheelbarrow and a pickaxe moving steadily through a pile of displaced earth. Dorothea watched for longer than she had intended to. There was something in the economy of the woman's movement, the complete absence of any gesture that was not functional, that she found difficult to look away from. It was not admiration exactly. It was the sensation of recognizing something you do not have a name for. "Neil," she called out to her husband, who was reading papers at the kitchen table. "What is the woman next door doing?" Cornelius did not look up. "No idea," he said. "Not our concern." Dorothea turned back to the window. She watched for another moment. Then she went back to her writing and sat for a long time without producing a single word. The man who sold Hazel her supplies was named Ward Gilpin. He was 63 years old and had run Gilpin's General and Hardware on the main street of Millhaven since 1869. He had the broad and settled authority of a man who had never left his county, which is a different kind of authority than the kind that comes from having been many places. He was not unkind. He was simply certain in the way that people become certain when nothing has ever badly surprised them. When Hazel laid out her order on his counter, he went through it item by item with the deliberate patience of a man who wanted her to understand that he was not going to be rushed. Canvas vapor barrier material, cedar post stock, a length of flat iron for reinforcing the trapdoor frame, and finally a small cast iron parlor stove, the direct vent model with the offset flue collar, one of only two he had in stock. He set the stove order aside and looked at her over the counter. "I know what you're building out there," he said. "I've heard." "Then you know what I need." "What you need," Ward said, "is a good stack of firewood and a tarp that fits. Every family in this valley that's been here more than 2 years gets through winter on exactly that. You're digging down through your own floor, Mrs. Voss. You're going to break your back and spend your savings on a hole." Hazel looked at the stove order on the counter. "The tarp blows away," she said, "and wet wood doesn't burn. A heavy tarp properly staked does not blow away. It does in the kind of wind that makes a tarp matter." She said it without heat, the way she said most things, as a statement of observed fact rather than a point of argument. Ward wrote up the order. After she left, he found himself telling the story to the next three customers who came in, and the telling had in it the particular mixture of affection and condescension that people use when they find something both touching and foolish. By the end of the week, the name had taken hold on Blackwood Road, and then in the rest of the town, passed along in stores and churchyards and at the post office window. The Mole Woman of Millhaven. It was not vicious, but it was not kind either. It was the kind of name that forecloses conversation, that makes it unnecessary to take a person seriously because you have already placed them in a category. Hazel knew about the name. She did not mention it. She kept digging. What saved Hazel from a particular kind of loneliness that summer was the boy across the fence. Tobias Crane was 19 years old and had come to Millhaven from a farm outside of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, with nothing except a serviceable knowledge of horses and the kind of physical endurance that comes from having worked since childhood without anyone asking whether you were tired. He worked for Cornelius Allgate, doing the labor that Cornelius needed done, but did not want to think about mucking out the small stable, splitting decorative firewood for the porch pile, running errands to town. He was a quiet and attentive young man who observed the world around him with the patience of someone who has learned that the world does not slow down to explain itself. The first time he stopped at the fence to watch Hazel work, he said nothing. He stood for perhaps 10 minutes, watching the rhythm of her work, the way she positioned the pickaxe before each stroke, the system by which she sorted the displaced earth into wheelbarrow loads. Then he went back to his own tasks. He came back the following Saturday and the one after that. Eventually, he began to ask questions, and they were the right kind of questions, specific, practical, without the condescension that the rest of the town's questions carried. "Why white oak?" he asked one morning, leaning on the fence rail. "For the firewood." Hazel set the pickaxe down and straightened her back. "Burns slow and even," she said. "Softwood burns hot and fast. You get 2 hours from a pine log, maybe 3. In a long storm, that matters." "How long are you planning for?" "Long enough. And the stove. Why the small one, not a regular wood stove?" "Because in a small, enclosed space underground, a regular wood stove will cook you. The parlor stove puts out enough heat for the room without stripping all the oxygen. The flue arrangement is the key." Toby nodded slowly, the nod of someone storing information, not merely acknowledging it. Hazel picked up the pickaxe again. After a moment, she added without looking at him, "Any other questions, ask them. Don't just stand there looking like you're working something out." After that, the questions came more regularly, and Hazel found that answering them was not a burden. The boy listened the way she had listened to Francis Two Clouds 30 years ago, with the whole of his attention, without the need to demonstrate that he already knew. The day the earth gave up its secret was a Thursday in late July. Hazel was extending the northeast corner of the dugout when the edge of her pickaxe struck something that was not stone. The sound was wrong, hollow, and metallic, and she went to her knees and cleared the surrounding earth with her hands. What she uncovered was a tin box roughly the size of a large book, sealed at the seams with solder that had darkened to the color of old charcoal. She carried it up into the light and opened it with a chisel. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth that had mostly survived, was a journal. The cover was dark brown leather, cracked at the spine. On the inside front page, in a careful hand, Ezra Whitmore, Millhaven Settlement, Montana Territory, April 1863. She read it that evening at the kitchen table, moving through the years of it, the entries about weather and planting and trade and illness, the small negotiations of a life lived at the edge of viability. Most of it was ordinary in the way that survival is ordinary, constant, unglamorous, demanding everything. Then she reached the final entry. The handwriting was different here. The letters were larger and less controlled, as if written by firelight in a hurry or by a hand that was shaking. February 1868. The storm came on the 14th and did not leave for 17 days. The Carver family on the North Ridge, husband and wife, and 3 children, all of them gone, found in March when the snow came down. They had firewood, but the chimney was blocked with ice, and they could not light the stove. "We survived because of the hole. It is always the hole." To whoever reads this, dig deeper than you think you need. Dig deeper than seems reasonable. The hole is the only thing that does not lie to you. Hazel sat with the journal closed in her hands for a long time. The light outside was going, and the cabin was growing dim around her. Then she went down into the dugout with a lantern, and she stood in the center of the half-finished room and looked at the walls and the ceiling and the stove alcove she had begun cutting into the east wall. She picked up the pickaxe and dug for another 2 hours, going deeper than she had originally planned. It was the Saturday after she found the journal that Agnes Moorfield knocked on her door for the first time. Agnes was 65 years old and had lived in the small frame house at the end of Blackwood Road since 1872, when her husband had brought her out from Ohio. He had died in 1879, caught under a collapsed mine timber, and she had stayed because leaving would have required a kind of energy she no longer had, and because Millhaven was, despite everything, home. She was a quiet woman, not from shyness, but from a long habit of watching and listening that had settled into her like a second nature. She knocked on Hazel's door that Saturday morning with a small cornbread loaf wrapped in a cloth, and she came inside without much ceremony and sat down at the kitchen table while Hazel poured coffee. They sat together in the comfortable silence of two women who have both learned that the world does not owe them conversation, and after a while Agnes set her cup down and looked at her hands. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I have been needing to tell someone for about 20 years. I think you might be the right person." She told Hazel about the Harpers, a family who had lived on the ridge above Blackwood Road in the early years before Agnes had arrived, but in the stories of the older residents, not a legend exactly, more of a warning that the old-timers told, and the newer ones did not know to take seriously. 5 of them, husband, wife, 3 grown children. The largest house on the ridge, well-built and well-provisioned. Dead in the blizzard of February 1864, Agnes had not seen them die, but she had heard from the woman who had lived across from them and who told the story only once before she refused to speak of it again, that there had been knocking in the night, that someone had come out of the Harper house in the dark and the storm and had knocked on the neighbor's door, and that the neighbor, a woman alone, had opened the door and looked out into the white darkness and then closed it again because the storm was too violent to step into, and she had no rope and no way to follow the sound. Agnes had carried that story for 21 years, not because she had been there, because she understood with the particular understanding of someone who has lived long enough to see the shape of things, that the neighbor's choice had been made in an instant with nothing to work with, and that no amount of wanting to have been different would have made it different. What she had never been able to explain to herself was why the story stayed so heavy, why it sat in her chest every February like a weight that had been placed there on purpose. "Because you knew there had to be another way," Hazel said, "and you didn't know what it was." Agnes looked at her. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly it." Hazel was quiet for a moment. "A rope," she said. The neighbor needed a rope tied to the door, one end secured inside the other end, to follow into the storm. You can go 60, 70, 80 feet in zero visibility with a rope. Without one, you are lost in 20 steps. Agnes looked at her as if she were doing a calculation. "Is that what you'll do if something happens? If someone needs to be reached?" "That's part of what I'm building for, yes." Agnes was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "May I come back to ask more questions?" "You don't have to ask," Hazel said. After that, Agnes came once a week on Wednesday afternoons. She always knocked, even though Hazel had told her she did not need to. She asked careful questions. How many people would the dugout hold? Whether the trap door could be opened from both sides? What happened to the flue pipe if snow accumulated on the chimney above? Hazel answered each question directly without elaboration, the way she had learned to talk to people who were genuinely trying to learn something and did not need to be convinced that it mattered. The July afternoon of Cornelius Allgate's garden party was warm and bright, the kind of afternoon that makes Montana territory feel like a promise kept. He had set up tables on the wide lawn between his house and the fence, and the guests were people with property interests and social standing, men from Helena and from Billings, passing through a judge from the territorial capital, 2 land agents and the wives who accompanied them. Ward Gilpin was there, standing near the drinks table with the comfortable authority of a man at home everywhere in his own town. Hazel was working. She had a load of earth to move from the morning's digging, and she was moving it wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow to the garden beds. She was aware of the party. She was not interested in the party. Cornelius noticed her from across the fence. He waited until he had an audience assembled, the way he always did, before he said anything he considered especially clever. Then he raised his voice to Carrie. "Mrs. Voss," he called, "you've been at that all summer. Where exactly are you planning to come out, Seattle, Denver? There was laughter. Several of the guests turned to look. Hazel set the wheelbarrow down and wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She looked at Cornelius the way she had learned to look at terrain before committing to a route steadily, without hurry, taking in what was actually there. Preparing for winter, she said. The earth holds heat, Mr. Aldgate. It's an old homesteader method. We have a $500 furnace, Mrs. Voss. We don't need homesteader methods. Ward Gilpin, emboldened by the company, added his voice. That's right. Although I'll say she works hard for a mole woman. More laughter. Hazel picked up the wheelbarrow handles and went back to work. She did not look at any of them again. Dorothea had been standing near the edge of the gathering during this exchange, holding a glass of lemonade. She laughed with the others, the social reflex of a woman who had spent decades in rooms where the cost of not laughing at the right moment was too high to consider. But she watched Hazel push the wheelbarrow back toward the storage room entrance, unhurried, without any visible alteration in her expression or her pace, and something in that image resisted the easy category of the mole woman joke. She looked down at her lemonade. She did not finish it. The legal notice arrived 2 weeks after the party. Deputy Marshal Clem Hadley came to Hazel's door on a Wednesday morning with the careful expression of a man executing an unpleasant duty he has been asked to execute by someone whose opinion of him matters. He was 46, a local man who had grown up in the valley and had learned that authority in Millhaven resided, practically speaking, with whoever paid the most in property taxes. Cornelius Aldgate paid the most in property taxes on Blackwood Road. The document Hadley presented was a formal complaint under Montana territorial statutes regarding earthworks and construction near shared property boundaries. The specific language cited potential structural risk to adjacent foundations and potential negative effect on area property values. The complainant was listed as concerned residents of Blackwood Road, which was not a legal entity, but which served in the framing of the complaint to diffuse the personal nature of it. Hazel read the document from beginning to end. Then she read it again. Then she handed it back to Hadley. Deputy Marshal, she said, the work I am doing is entirely within the boundaries of my own property at a distance of no less than 6 feet from the nearest shared boundary line. There is no provision in territorial code that prohibits subsurface excavation within those parameters. Yes, ma'am, but the formal complaint requires a territorial inspector to verify. Could be 2 to 3 weeks. When the inspector comes, I will stop for the duration of his inspection. Not 1 day more than that. And I would ask you to relay a message to whoever filed this complaint. Hadley waited. Tell him I know it was him, she said, and tell him I have read the relevant statutes more carefully than he has. Hadley nodded once with the slight, uncomfortable dignity of a man who is being used as a messenger by someone more intelligent than him and knows it. He turned and walked back up the road. Hazel stood in the doorway until he was out of sight. Then she went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and placed both palms flat on the wood surface and looked at them. Not at her hands in particular, at the surface beneath them. She was not angry. Anger would have been simpler. What she felt was the particular exhaustion of having to spend energy defending the right to do something that should not require defense, while the thing she actually needed to do remained undone and the clock continued to move. Toby was in the stable yard across the fence when Hadley left. He had seen the document change hands through the gap in the fence boards. He stood for a moment with the stable broom in his hands, looking in the direction of the deputy's receding back. He knew who had sent the complaint. He had not been told. He simply knew. That afternoon he came to the fence as usual. He did not ask about the legal notice. He asked instead whether she thought the corner post on the east wall was bearing enough weight, and Hazel answered him, and they talked through the structural question with the same directness they always used. When he left, she watched him go and thought that whatever else was wrong with the situation, the boy had his priorities in the right order. The territorial inspector came from Helena. 3 weeks later, a dry and methodical man who measured everything twice with a steel tape and wrote his findings in a leather notebook without comment. He spent 20 minutes on the property. He found no violations. He conveyed this finding to Hadley in writing with a notation that the earthworks were entirely within the boundary of the property in question and presented no documentable risk to adjacent structures. Hadley brought the finding to Cornelius. No one knew what was said in that conversation, but Toby was in the hallway when Cornelius came back into the house, and the expression on his employer's face was one he had not seen before, not anger. Exactly because anger has a release in it, something more compressed than anger, something that had nowhere to go. That evening, Hazel descended into the nearly finished dugout with an oil lamp, the Whitmore journal, and nothing else. She sat down on the packed clay floor and opened the journal to its last page and read the final entry one more time in the lamplight. Then she set the journal down. She sat alone in the earth for a long time. The lamp threw a low orange circle around her. The walls were close and solid and smelled of clean minerals and cedar. Outside, 60 feet above her and half a mile away, the town of Millhaven was going about its evening. The tears, when they came, were quiet and brief. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry in a way that asked for anything. She cried for her father, whose name was Thomas Voss, and who had stepped out of a door in Idaho Territory on a February night in 1862 and had not come back. She cried for the Carver family on the North Ridge in 1868 and for the Harpers who had knocked in the dark and not been heard. She cried for the fact that the knowledge of how to survive had to be fought for, had to be defended in written complaints and territorial inspections, when the people who needed it most were the ones who had not yet been tested. Then she was done. She wiped her face with the hem of her work shirt. She stood up, picked up the lamp and the pickaxe, and went back to work. She had measured the room carefully before she stopped. She dug 18 more inches into the east wall than her original plan had called for. Not because the room needed it, because Ezra Whitmore had told her to go deeper than seemed reasonable, and she had decided in the lamplight below the earth that she was going to take his advice all the way. By the end of October, the dugout was finished. 12 feet wide and 14 feet long, accessed by a trapdoor cut into the storage room floor, hinged with flat iron and sealed at the edges with a double layer of felt. The staircase was 8 treads of solid fir, steep but sturdy. The walls were cedar post framing lined with the canvas vapor barrier, each panel overlapping the one below it and sealed at the joints with pine pitch. The floor was packed, clay swept clean, covered in places with salvaged burlap. In the alcove carved into the east wall sat the cast iron parlor stove, its flue pipe angled through the old stone chimney of the cabin above, at a configuration that had taken her 4 attempts to get right. Along the rear wall, she stacked the firewood, 3 cords of white oak and ash, split and seasoned, since April dry to the core, the ends pale and clean where the moisture had entirely left them. The room smelled of dry earth and cedar and pine pitch. When she lit the stove for the first test in late October, the room went from 48 degrees to 68 degrees in 35 minutes. She sat on the single wooden crate she had brought down as furniture and drank a cup of coffee and listened to the complete and extraordinary silence of being underground. The same week, Cornelius Aldgate took delivery of 12 sacks of coal from a wagon out of Billings. 2 hired men stacked the sacks in the coal storage shed at the back of his property, a timber-framed structure with a solid roof and a door that faced north toward the prevailing winter wind. Cornelius covered the door opening with a waxed canvas tarp and secured it with a length of hemp rope tied to two short stakes driven into the frozen ground. "Mrs. Voss," he called across the fence when the delivery was done, the particular pleasantness in his voice of a man who has just resolved a competition he believed he was losing. "I finished in one afternoon. 12 sacks of coal in a furnace that has not required me to dig a single inch of my own property." Hazel was at the trap door checking the latch mechanism. She looked across at the coal shed. She looked at the direction the door faced. She looked at the tarp and at the rope stakes in the frozen ground. She looked at all of this for exactly as long it took her to understand what she was looking at. "Good," she said. She lowered herself through the trap door and pulled it shut above her. Toby was splitting decorative logs near the stable when this exchange happened. He had his own line of sight to the coal shed. He followed the same sequence of observations that Hazel had followed: the door direction, the tarp, the stakes, and arrived at the same conclusion by a different route. He had grown up in Iowa. He knew what north wind carrying ice could do to a canvas tarp secured with two stakes. He opened his mouth. He looked over at Cornelius, who was already walking back toward his house with the satisfied posture of a man who has just won an argument. Toby closed his mouth. He set the splitting maul down and stood for a moment with his hands at his sides. The late October sky was the pale, clean blue of a season that was almost over. He picked up the splitting maul and went back to work. Millhaven, Montana Territory. November 1885 to the evening of February 16, 1886. The winter came in gently, which was the first lie. November passed with light snow and temperatures that never broke below zero. December was milder still, the kind of December that made newcomers write cheerful letters back east about how the frontier reputation for severity had been overstated. The sky was blue more days than not. The roads stayed passable. People moved around the valley without the particular caution that a hard season demands. And that ease worked on them the way ease always works, slowly, without announcement, eroding the margin between what they were prepared for and what was actually coming. Cornelius Aldgate hosted a Christmas dinner that was talked about in Millhaven for weeks afterward. He had the table set with china brought up from St. Louis, and the central heating furnace kept the house at a temperature that had his guests removing their coats before the soup course. He refilled glasses and moved through his own rooms with the satisfaction of a man whose thesis about the world has just been confirmed. The frontier was manageable. It responded to capital and planning. The $500 furnace had been, as he had always maintained, entirely justified. Dorothea sat at the far end of the table and was a gracious and attentive hostess. She asked the right questions of the right people and laughed at the right moments and made sure every guest felt that their presence at this table in this house, in this remote valley of Montana Territory, was not an inconvenience, but a pleasure. She was very good at this. She had been very good at it for 20 years. But twice during the evening, she found herself standing at the window of the hallway looking out toward the dark shape of Hazel Voss's cabin. No light showed from the main floor. The small iron lamp that sometimes glowed in the storage room window was dark. Dorothea knew what that meant. She had watched enough of the autumn to understand that when that window was dark, Hazel was below in the room beneath the room, doing whatever it was she did down there with her firewood and her cast-iron stove and her prepared silence. She stood at the window for longer than she meant to. Then a guest called her name from the dining room, and she went back to her table. Dorothea's piece for the Philadelphia Ladies' Gazette was due in the second week of January. She'd been working on it since October, and it was nearly finished, a careful and well-constructed argument that the comforts of refined living are not incompatible with the frontier illustrated by the particulars of her own household, the china, the furnace, the wallpapered interior, the ordered routine they had maintained despite the distance from any city of consequence. She had included Hazel in the piece. One sentence near the end offered as a contrast that underscored her central point. She had described her neighbor as a curious local woman whose homestead methods provided an amusing illustration of how differently people chose to meet the same challenge. She read that sentence again in the second week of January, sitting at her writing table with the finished draft in front of her. She had read it a dozen times over the previous months and found nothing wrong with it. Now she read it once more and found something wrong with it that she could not immediately name. Outside the window in the pale January morning, Hazel was checking the exterior of the trapdoor frame. She moved around the perimeter of it with the focused attention of someone looking for specific things in specific places, testing the hinges and the seal and the clearance on the latch. There was no performance in the movement. Nobody was watching her, and she did not behave as though anyone might be. She was simply doing what needed to be done because it needed to be done. Dorothea looked down at her draft. At the sentence about the curious local woman with the amusing methods, she sat with it for a long time. Then she picked up the pages and tore them in half. Not violently, deliberately, the way you correct an arithmetic error without drama, because the number is wrong and a wrong number does nothing except mislead everyone who works from it. She took a clean sheet of paper and wrote at the top in her own hand, not for the column, but for herself. What does a woman who has survived know that I do not? She stared at that sentence for a while. Then she put the paper in the drawer of her writing table and went to make coffee. She did not start the column again for 3 days. When she did, she wrote something entirely different, a piece about the particular quality of winter light in the mountain valleys, which had nothing to do with furnaces or china or the confirmation of civilization. Her editor wrote back that it was some of her best work. She did not show the letter to Cornelius. Toby Crane came to the fence every Saturday that winter, and the conversations that developed there had the character of an apprenticeship, though neither of them named it that. He had stopped asking about construction and materials. The dugout was finished and there was nothing left to ask about it. What he asked about now was harder to specify: how you read the sky in this particular valley, what the behavior of horses told you about pressure changes, when the silence before a storm was ordinary silence and when it was something else. Hazel answered each question with the same flat directness she always used, without praise or elaboration, and Toby received the answers the same way. The conversations troubled him in a way he did not discuss with anyone. They troubled him because the more he understood, the more clearly he could see the gap between what he understood and what existed 30 feet away on the other side of the fence in the coal shed with the north-facing door. He had tried once. It was a January afternoon, gray, and still the kind of stillness that sits on a valley before something larger arrives. Toby had gone to Cornelius's study to report on the stable. He had stood in the doorway with the stable inventory in his hand and waited until he had his employer's attention, and then he had said it as plainly and respectfully as he knew how. The coal shed door faced north, he said. The waxed canvas covering it was secured with 2 stakes in ground that had been frozen since November. If a hard storm came with wind out of the north before snow carrying freezing rain, first, the way some storms in this valley did, the canvas would not hold. And coal that had been penetrated by ice could not be burned until it was thawed, which in a storm of any duration would be too late to matter. Cornelius had been reading a land transfer document. He looked up from it with the particular expression of a man who has decided in advance that what he is about to hear is not worth his full attention. "Toby," he said, You're a good worker, but the men who installed that furnace were specialists from Denver. They have designed heating systems across the entire northern plains. What you're describing is a scenario they would have accounted for. With respect, Mr. Aldgate, those men haven't wintered in this valley. A pause. Something passed across Cornelius's face that was not quite anger and not quite consideration. Are you finished with the stable report? He said. Toby set the inventory sheet on the corner of the desk. Yes, sir, he said. He walked back to the stable and stood in the doorway and looked at the coal shed for a long time. The stakes in the frozen ground, the canvas tarp, the door facing exactly the wrong direction. He stood there until the cold drove him inside. That Saturday at the fence, he asked Hazel, if a person has done everything they can reasonably do to warn someone, and the warning isn't taken, what do they do next? Hazel was splitting kindling on the chopping block. She brought the hatchet down twice before she answered. They make sure they've done everything they can do for themselves, she said. And if there are other people nearby who haven't, she set the hatchet down and looked at him directly. If your roof is on fire, she said, you put it out. Then you worry about your neighbor's roof. Toby nodded. He didn't come back to the subject, but on his way back across the yard that afternoon, he stopped at the coal shed and looked at the tarp again. And when he went to bed that night, he lay awake for a while going over the geometry of it. The coal shed, the direction of the worst wind in this valley, and the distance between the north side of the Aldgate property and the storage room window of Hazel Voss's cabin. The 14th of February fell on a Sunday. Hazel was awake before 5, which was not unusual. She had slept lightly for 20 years, a professional habit that had outlasted the profession. She built a small fire in the kitchen stove and put the coffee on and went as she did every morning to check the barometer. It hung on the kitchen wall near the window, a brass instrument mounted in a mahogany case calibrated by hand. It had belonged to her grandfather, who had brought it from Vermont in 1841, and it had been in her possession since she was 23. She had learned to read it the way you learn to read another person's face, not by the position of the needle alone, but by the direction and speed of its movement, the quality of the change. A needle that drops steadily means weather. A needle that drops fast means a decision. The needle was not dropping steadily. It was moving in a way she had not seen in 15 years of daily observation. A continuous fall with no hesitation, no leveling, nothing that suggested the system producing it had any intention of stopping. She stood in front of it for a full minute without moving. Then she went to the door and stepped outside in her coat and boots. The air was wrong, not cold in the way that the previous 3 months had been cold, which was a dry and manageable cold that smelled of pinene and open skin. This was different. The air had no smell at all. It was completely still, the kind of stillness that has weight behind it. The sky to the west was the color of a bruise, that particular mixture of purple and gray and dark yellow that she had only seen a handful of times in her life. And every one of those times had been before something that tested the outer edge of what she thought she could survive. No birds. The jays that had been working the bare branches outside the kitchen window for 3 months were gone. The horses in the town stable a quarter-mile away were making sounds she could hear from where she stood. She went back inside and began moving things downstairs. She worked methodically the way she had always worked, without visible urgency, but without pause. Food from the pantry, canned goods, dried beans, salt pork, coffee flour in a sealed tin, dried herbs, water in every container she had, blankets, the wool ones, not the cotton ones, 3 of them, the oil lamp and 2 full spare canisters, the medical kit she had assembled over the previous summer based on what a field medic named Sergeant Holland had taught her during her 3rd year in Wyoming, bandages, carbolic acid, a needle, and silk thread, willow bark for fever. the longest rope she owned coiled and tied, and the barometer taken down from the wall and carried below because she wanted to be able to read it from underground. She made 4 trips. On the 4th, coming back up the stairs with the empty basket, she stood at the kitchen window and looked across the fence. Toby was closing the stable doors on the Aldgate property, moving with purpose. He looked up and saw her in the window. He stood still for a moment. Then he looked at the sky to the west and then back at her, and she could see from his posture that he had read the sky and arrived at the same place she had arrived. She nodded once through the glass. He nodded back. He turned and went inside. At 2 in the afternoon, the rain began. It did not look like dangerous rain. It came down straight and steady, and if you had not spent time in mountain valleys and did not know what straight, steady rain at 30 degrees Fahrenheit meant, in the presence of a pressure system dropping at that rate, you might have stood at your window and thought, well, February rain, unpleasant but manageable. People in Millhaven did stand at their windows and think approximately this. Cornelius Aldgate looked out from his study and made a note to have Toby lay additional tarp weights on the coal shed tarp before dark. He could not find Toby. He looked in the stable, the woodshed, the storage room at the back of the house. He called from the back porch twice. The rain came down on his shoulders and darkened his coat, and he went back inside annoyed and decided to address it himself in the morning. Agnes Moorfield had been watching the sky since noon. She had packed a small bag in October at Hazel's suggestion, kept it by the door, and added to it periodically throughout the winter a change of dry clothes, a tin of crackers, the small Bible her mother had given her in 1841, a wool scarf. She had done this quietly without mentioning it to anyone because the alternative was explaining why she was doing it, which would have required telling the Harper family story again, and she had told it once and had no intention of telling it twice. At 2:30, she decided it was time. She put on her heaviest coat and her rubber overshoes and picked up the bag and opened her front door. The porch steps had become something else. The rain falling at exactly the temperature required to freeze on contact with any surface colder than the air had coated every horizontal and vertical surface in a smooth, clear shell of ice. The steps were not slippery. They were a continuous inclined plane of material that had no more friction than window glass. Agnes put her right foot on the first step and it slid sideways, and she went down hard, the bag landing beside her, her left knee taking the impact on the ice-coated wood. She did not cry out. She sat up, assessed the situation with the calm of someone who has lived long enough to know that panic is a luxury, and tried to stand. Her feet found no purchase. The path from the porch to the gate to the road to Hazel's cabin, all of it was the same continuous sheet of ice. The rain was still falling. Agnes sat on her front steps in the freezing rain with her bag in her lap, and she began to understand that she could not get where she needed to go. She did not see Toby Crane until he was already halfway across the road. He had been watching from the Aldgate stable window, having found a reason to stay in the stable rather than return to the house after he saw the barometer reading that morning, and he had seen Agnes go down from 50 yards. He had a length of rope, the longest from the stable tack room, tied around his waist before he was through the stable door. He had secured the other end to the corner post of the Aldgate gate. He went across the iced road on his hands and knees because there was no other way to go across it, and the ice punished every surface it touched him on, finding the gaps at his collar and his cuffs and working cold into all of them. It took him 12 minutes to reach Agnes and another 14 to get her upright and moving. She was a small woman, but the ice made every step a negotiation, and he talked her through each one, where to put her foot, how much weight to commit, when to pause. His hands were bright red by the time they reached the gate of Hazel's property. By the time they reached the back door, he could no longer feel his fingers. Hazel opened the door before he knocked. She took Agnes by the arm and pulled her inside. Toby stood on the threshold, rain still coming down on him, his coat dark and heavy with it, and looked back across toward the Aldgate house. "He didn't know where you were," Hazel said. "He didn't look in the right place." "Come in. Mrs. Voss, if I'm here, there's no one over there who can." "I know," she said. "Come in, Toby." He came in. She closed the door. The storm announced its true nature at 4 o'clock. The freezing rain stopped. In a space of perhaps 3 minutes, the air temperature outside dropped from 28 degrees to something that felt like a different category of existence. The sound of the drop was not dramatic. There was no sound at all. The absence of the rain's tapping on the window was the first signal, and then the windows themselves went white with crystals blooming inward from the frames, and then the wind came. It came from the north as Hazel had known it would, and it did not build gradually. It arrived at full strength, a sustained roar that was less like wind and more like the entire sky pressing down on the valley from one direction with everything it had. The cabin shuddered once along its whole length. The stovepipe in the kitchen shook. A tin cup on the counter vibrated its way to the edge and fell. Hazel was already at the trapdoor. Agnes went down first, taking the stairs carefully, her breath coming short from the cold and the exertion of the last hour. Toby went next. Hazel went last, pulling the trapdoor down and latching it from below. The sound reduced itself to a low and distant thrum, like something heard through water, and then even that faded to almost nothing. Agnes stopped on the 4th step down and stood very still, one hand on each wall of the staircase, breathing. The darkness was complete until Hazel lit the lamp. "I don't like small spaces," Agnes said. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact offered without expectation. "I know," Hazel said. "The light helps, and the fire will help more." She opened the stove and laid the kindling and the paper and reached for the wood. The oak caught in under a minute. By the time the three of them had settled into the available spaces, the room had begun to change around them, the chill giving way to something steadier and gentler, the walls doing their part as they always did. Toby sat against the east wall with his back to the stacked wood and his knees drawn up and watched the fire and said nothing. Agnes kept her eyes on the lamp rather than the ceiling, and gradually her breathing slowed. In the house next door, Cornelius Aldgate was discovering the specific quality of a system failure that has no manual override. When the power of the wind registered on him as something beyond the ordinary, he went to the basement to check the furnace. The furnace was running. He could hear it, the familiar low roar of the coal combustion, and he felt better for approximately 90 seconds. Then he went upstairs and held his hand over the nearest floor register and felt nothing. Cold air. Not just room temperature, but actively cold, as if the register were drawing in outside air rather than distributing warmth. He went to the next register. The same. He checked the 3rd and the 4th, and the result was identical. He went back to the basement. The furnace was burning coal, and the heat it produced was going somewhere, but it was not going through the pipes into the rooms above. He traced the distribution pipe from the furnace to where it met the exterior wall and went through to the outdoor section, and when he pressed his palm against the metal of the pipe just inside the wall, it was as cold as the iron on a January morning. The distribution pipe passed through the exterior wall and connected to an external section before re-entering the house through the foundation. That external section had been encased in ice since approximately 4 in the afternoon. The hot air the furnace produced had nowhere to go except back around itself and out through the exhaust. He stood in the basement with this information for a full minute, processing it the way he processed business information, looking for the variable He had missed the consideration that had not been in the proposal from the Denver installers. There was no variable. The system had been designed for temperatures it had not encountered. The men from Denver had built for the winter they knew, which was not the winter that was currently happening above his head. He put on his heaviest coat and forced his way out through the back door. The wind hit him like a physical barrier, a wall of moving force that was not air in any ordinary sense, but something with density and intention. He bent into it and moved toward the coal shed by feel one hand against the fence rail. His face turned to the side because looking directly into it was not possible. He reached the coal shed in 40 seconds. He found the tarp in 0 seconds because the tarp was not there. The rope that had secured it to the stakes was still attached to one stake, the hemp swinging in the wind like a flag that has forgotten what it was supposed to mark. The coal was exposed. The freezing rain had fallen on it for nearly 2 hours before the temperature dropped, penetrating the porous surface of every sack and working into the interior. When the temperature had dropped, it had flash frozen what it found there, not just the surfaces, but the pore structure of the coal itself, so that the sacks were now not sacks of coal, but sacks of coal-shaped ice, each one fused to its neighbors into a mass that did not move when he pushed it. He pushed it anyway. He pushed it with both hands and then with his shoulder, and then he went back inside and found the coal-splitting hammer and brought it back out and swung it at the nearest sack. The hammer bounced. The vibration went up his arms and into his shoulders, and he stood there in the wind with the hammer at his side. He was a man who was accustomed to having options. In 23 years of commercial real estate, every problem he had ever faced had, on examination, resolved into a question of resources, how much deployed, where, and who could be called. Standing in a frozen Montana coal yard at 5 in the afternoon, with the wind screaming across the back of his neck and a hammer that accomplished nothing, he found himself in the specific and unfamiliar territory of a problem that could not be resolved by resource allocation. The coal was frozen. The pipe was frozen. The tarp was gone. Toby was gone. There was no one to call. He said almost to himself, almost to the wind, $500. The wind did not indicate that it had heard. He went back inside. Dorothea had been building a fire in the decorative stone fireplace since the power of the furnace became apparent. She was not without resourcefulness. She had found the brass-handled fire iron and the hearth broom and the decorative log basket that had never in their time in Millhaven been used for anything except aesthetic effect. She had laid the fire correctly. She knew how to lay a fire paper and kindling and split wood arranged in the proper configuration, and the fire was burning. The problem was the room. The front parlor of the Aldgate house was 22 feet long and 14 feet wide, with a ceiling that rose 14 feet at its center peak. The fireplace, ornamental in its conception, put out enough heat to warm the immediate vicinity of the hearth. Beyond roughly 8 feet in any direction, the heat dissipated into the volume of cold air that the plate glass windows were conducting inward at a rate that could not be matched by a single fire-burning hardwood at a decorative pace. She burned the decorative logs in the basket. She went upstairs and brought down the spare blankets from the cedar chest and the extra comforters from the unused bedroom. She burned 2 wooden chair backs from the dining room set, which gave her 20 minutes of additional heat and a smell of lacquer that made her eyes water. She put on every layer of clothing she could manage and sat as close to the hearth as she could get, and she did not feel warm. She felt less cold. That was all that was available. By the morning of the second day, the thermometer that Cornelius had hung in the parlor for reference during the summer read 18 degrees. By evening, it read 11. He had found 3 more things to burn, including a crate of packing materials from the move and a wooden shutter that had been stored in the attic, and none of it was sufficient. On the morning of the third day, Dorothea woke on the parlor floor where she had been sleeping, closest to the hearth, and found that the fire had gone out during the night. She did not have the sensation of cold, so much as the absence of the capacity to feel anything at the extremities. Her hands, when she held them up, were a pale lavender at the tips of the fingers. She tried to rebuild the fire and could not manage the fine work of tearing paper with fingers that did not answer the instruction. Cornelius rebuilt it for her. He had wood left, half a crate, 2 chair legs, a section of baseboard he had pried off the wall with a fire iron. When the fire was going again, she huddled into it, and he crouched beside her and looked at her face and did not like what he saw. "I need you to stay awake," he said. "I am awake," she said. "Neil, we need to get help. The storm is still. The storm has been going for 3 days." She looked at him with the clarity that sometimes comes when a situation has stripped everything back to its essential structure. "We are going to mine in this house if we stay in it." He stood up. He looked around the room he had built with such care, the plaster walls, the plate glass, the ornamental fireplace that was now burning chair legs, the decorative rugs that were serving as additional insulation against the floor. He had designed this room for a specific set of conditions, and those conditions did not include what was happening outside. The room was not a failure of taste or ambition. It was simply not built for this. He had not built it for this because he had not in any real way believed this was possible. He put on his coat. Dorothea said, "Neil." "I'm going next door," he said. She tried to say something else. Her eyes went to the middle distance and then closed, and she did not say it. He got out through the back door by leaning against it with his full weight, and the wind that met him on the other side was at 30 degrees below zero, with a northerly wind chill that took his breath and replaced it with nothing. He could not see more than a few feet. The yard he had stood in 6 months ago with a glass of bourbon, calling out to his neighbor and laughing, was unrecognizable. Everything was white and moving. He found the fence by falling into it. He went along the fence by hand. He found the gap where the gate latch was crossed the open ground between the 2 properties with his arms out for balance, and reached the back wall of the cabin on Blackwood Road. He followed the wall to the window. He could see light inside, faint and warm, coming from the floor, coming from some space below the floor. He pressed his hand against the glass and knocked. His hand did not cooperate the way he wanted it to. The fingers were not responding individually. He made the best fist he could and brought it against the glass. Once, a pause, again. He was very cold. He had been cold before in his life, but this was a different kind of cold, the kind that does not announce itself as dangerous because it begins to remove the capacity for the assessment of danger. He knew that he should feel afraid. He could not locate the feeling. He knocked again, slower than the last time. Inside the cabin below the floor, in a room that smelled of dry wood and pine smoke, a woman who had been reading by firelight put her book down on her knee and looked at the ceiling. She knew the difference between wind and something else. She set the book down and stood up. The sound came again from above, fainter than the last. The rhythm of it had changed from a knock to something closer to a tap, and the interval between each tap was longer than the one before, as if the thing producing it was running out of the particular resource required. Hazel picked up the iron poker from beside the stove. She climbed the stairs and pushed the trap door open and stepped up into the frozen dark of the cabin above. The cold was immediate and total. Frost had formed on the interior walls. The water in the bucket by the kitchen stove had a skin of ice on the surface thick enough to hold its shape. Her breath came out in a dense cloud and fell rather than rose. She crossed to the rear window. She held the lamp up and looked through the glass. The shape on the other side was barely a shape. It was pressed against the window at an angle that suggested it was using the window as a support rather than as a door. The face was turned toward her, and it was the color of old tallow, and the lips were split in the corners, and the eyes, when they found her through the glass, had in them the unfocused quality of someone who has very little time left to find what they came looking for. She knew the face. She had known it for 8 months. She had never seen it look like this. She unlatched the window and pushed it open against the wind. The man on the other side did not come through it so much as fall through it, landing partway across the sill, and she caught him under the arms and pulled him the rest of the way, and he went down onto the floor and took a long, ragged breath that rattled in his chest like something loose. "Dorothea," Cornelius Aldgate said. His voice was barely audible. "She won't wake up. Please." Hazel knelt down beside him. She looked at his face for 1 second. She looked at the floor and the ice on the walls and the window still open behind them, the wind howling through it. Then she stood up and went to the trapdoor and called down into the warmth below. "Toby," she said, "get up. I need you." Millhaven, Montana Territory, February 16th to May 1886. Toby was on his feet before she finished saying his name. He came up the stairs fast, the lamp swinging in his hand, and found Cornelius on the kitchen floor and Hazel already moving toward the storage room. He took in the situation the way she had taught him to take in a situation without theater, without wasted motion, identifying the facts in the order of their urgency. The man on the floor was alive, but not by much. The woman across the yard was not alive, or not alive yet, and that was a different category of urgency entirely. "His wife," Hazel said. She was pulling the coil of rope from the hook behind the storage room door. "Unconscious on their parlor floor. I need to go." "I'm coming with you." "You stay here with him and with Agnes." Toby set the lamp down on the kitchen table. He looked at her not with the deference of an employee or the agitation of a young man who has not been heard, but with the settled directness of someone who has thought through the argument before it was asked for. "You told me," he said, "a rope is only as good as the person holding the other end. Mr. Aldgate can barely sit up. Agnes can't hold a rope against that wind. You need someone at this end who can pull." He paused. "You need me." She had the rope in both hands. She looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way she read terrain, looking for the honest line between what he was capable of and what he thought he was capable of. She found no gap between the two. "You hold the end," she said. "You do not come through the door under any circumstance until I pull twice. If I do not pull within 30 minutes, you take in the rope hand over hand until you have what's at the end of it. You understand what that means?" "Yes," he said. "Say it." "It means whatever is at the end might not be you anymore." She looked at him for one more second. Then she tied the rope around her waist with a bowline knot, the kind that does not tighten under load, and handed him the other end. She had Toby brace himself against the kitchen table with the rope around the table leg as a secondary anchor, and she took the small wooden sled from the storage room and the 2 blankets she had left warming beside the stove below, and she went to the back door and opened it. The cold entered the room like something with a will of its own. The yard between the 2 houses was 70 steps in ordinary conditions. She had counted it in October and again in December, the way she counted all the distances that might matter, walking them deliberately, converting space into number, so that number could be relied on when eyes could not. She went out with her head down and her left hand on the rope, and she counted. The wind was not constant. It came in surges, each one carrying a load of driven snow. So dense it was not individual particles anymore, but a single moving substance that had weight and direction and the particular hostility of something that does not distinguish between obstacles. She leaned into it when it surged and moved during the seconds between surges when the pressure dropped fractionally and there was something like forward progress available. At 22 steps, the rope behind her went taut for a moment. She felt Toby adjust his position, taking up the slack, finding a new angle of resistance. The rope went loose again and she kept moving. She thought about her father in the way she sometimes did when conditions were at their worst, not as grief but as a kind of navigation. Thomas Voss had gone out without a rope and had walked in circles in the dark until he could no longer walk. The rope behind her was the entire distance between his death and her survival, reduced to a single physical fact, a length of hemp connecting her to a 19-year-old from Iowa who was standing braced against a kitchen table in the frozen dark holding on. 41 steps. The wind surged and she stopped and turned her face to the side and waited for it to pass. When it did, she went forward again. 58, 63. Her right hand found the vertical surface of a wall. The Aldgate front door was unlocked, as Cornelius had left it. She pushed inside. The interior of the house was in a state she recognized from the aftermath of bad operations in the field, the specific disorder of a sustained emergency that has consumed everything available and left the remains of each attempt scattered where it was abandoned. The parlor floor held a heap of blankets and coats piled near the hearth where the fire had gone out again. Burned chair legs, a section of pried baseboard, a pair of brass candlesticks that had been used as makeshift fire irons and left at odd angles on the stone surround. And Dorothea Aldgate on the floor at the center of the heap, on her side, her knees drawn up completely still. Hazel crossed the room and went down on one knee beside her. She pressed two fingers to the side of Dorothea's throat and found the pulse slow and thin, working hard to do something that should not have required effort. The skin at her throat was cold, not the cold of a person sitting in a chilly room, the cold of a person whose body had begun to economize. She worked quickly with the efficiency of someone doing a thing they have prepared for and have no interest in making dramatic. She stripped the outermost wet layers from Dorothea's shoulders, rolled her onto the sled, and used the rope's trailing end to lash her down so she would not slide off on the return journey. She wrapped both blankets around her, tucking them under and over in the order that preserved the most core warmth. She looked up. On the small writing table by the window, a single sheet of paper. The lamp she had brought showed her the handwriting large and deliberate, stopping mid-sentence, where the cold had thickened the ink to the point it would not flow. What does a woman who has survived know that I do not? She looked at it for 2 seconds. Then she pulled twice on the rope. The return was 20 minutes of work that had no other quality in it. The sled caught on a ridge of ice at the midpoint of the yard, and she had to get behind it and push, while the rope pulled from ahead, and her boots found nothing underneath her for 3 full seconds before the sled broke free and moved. Her lungs had stopped feeling like lungs. They felt like something borrowed from a context in which breathing was optional, and she was currently past the limit of the lone. The back door of her cabin appeared as a rectangle of lesser darkness. Toby had the door open and was pulling with both hands on the rope, his feet planted against the base of the door frame, and she came through it, pulling the sled behind her, and went down onto one knee on the kitchen floor and stayed there for a moment with her eyes closed and nothing in her except the specific physical state that comes after you have done the thing you went out to do. Downstairs, she said, we need to get her downstairs now. Getting an unconscious woman down a steep staircase in a frozen cabin is not a graceful operation. Toby took her shoulders and Hazel took her feet, and they went down sideways 1 step at a time, and twice she nearly slipped, and once he did slip and caught himself against the wall with his elbow. Agnes, who had been sitting in the corner with her Bible and her lamp, stood up when she heard them coming and moved without being asked to the space beside the stove and pulled the nearest blanket back to receive what was coming. The moment Cornelius stepped off the last stair and set foot on the packed clay floor, he stopped. He had been moving on instinct since he went out the back door of his house, the mechanical forward motion of a man running on something below the level of decision. Now he stopped and stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides. The warmth reached him, not the aggressive artificial warmth of the furnace that had spent all those months trying to convince him it was civilization in mechanical form, but something that came from all directions at once, from the walls and the floor and the air itself, a warmth that did not announce itself but simply was. The fire in the stove was burning white oak dry and steady the way it had been burning for 3 days. The room smelled of it. He looked at the stacked wood along the rear wall. He had stood on the other side of a fence and laughed at this wood. He had stood there with a glass in his hand and laughed, and his guests had laughed, and the sound of that laughter had reached the woman who was now on her knees beside his wife, with her hands moving through the protocols for a condition that his laughter had helped create. He sat down against the wall. He did not say anything. He did not have anything to say. Hazel worked on Dorothea for 40 minutes. She removed every damp layer and replaced it with dry wool. She filled the 2 stone bottles she kept for this purpose from the pot of water on the flat top of the stove and placed them wrapped in cloth against the sides of Dorothea's torso, where the large blood vessels ran closest to the surface. She checked the pulse at intervals, watching for the small improvements. That meant the body was beginning to reclaim itself. Agnes held Dorothea's hand and did not move from her place and did not speak. This was the most useful thing Agnes could do, and she knew it. Toby sat against the east wall with his knees up, his hands still red from the rope. After a while, he looked at the wood stacked behind him, the pale ends of the split oak, each piece a uniform length, each row level and true. He thought about the Saturday mornings at the fence, the questions he had asked, and the answers he had been given. He thought about the conversation he had had with himself on the October afternoon, when he had stood in the yard looking at the coal shed door facing north, and had decided not to push harder than he had already pushed. He was 19 years old, and there was a woman alive because of what had happened in this room, and there was a set of things he had chosen not to do that he would carry with him for a long time. Not as guilt exactly, more as instruction. Cornelius did not sleep. He sat against the wall and watched the fire. Around midnight, when the others had settled into the shallow rest that cold and exhaustion produce, he spoke for the first time since he had come down the stairs. "The distribution pipe," he said. His voice was low, aimed at nothing in particular. "It runs through the exterior wall. I never asked them about that. The men from Denver. I never asked what happens when the exterior section freezes." Hazel was sitting on the wooden crate across the stove from him, awake, as she had been awake for the past 8 hours. She looked at him. "Would it have changed anything?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "If I had known it would fail, I would have had a backup, something that didn't depend on a pipe that goes outside." "You had a backup," she said. "It was across the fence." He looked at her then, and what was in his face was not the face he had worn at the fence all summer. That face had been the face of a man performing certainty for an audience that included himself. This was something plainer, a man looking at the precise shape of a mistake he had made and finding that it was larger than he had estimated and that it had a human cost that could not be renegotiated. He looked back at the fire. "I filed the legal complaint," he said. "I know, not because I believed the structural argument, because I wanted you to stop." Hazel was quiet for a moment. The fire settled in the stove, and she reached forward and adjusted the damper without getting up. "Why?" she said. He took a long time with the answer. Because every time I looked out the window and saw you working, he said slowly, I had a feeling I didn't have a name for. I know what it was now, but I didn't have a name for it then. She did not ask him what the name was. She understood that he was doing the difficult thing of arriving at a truth by himself, and that the right response to that was silence. After a while, he said, What's left of the wood? Enough, she said. More than enough. He was quiet again. Then he stood up from the floor slowly, his body stiff from cold and stillness, and he walked to the rear wall and stood in front of the stacked oak. He reached out and took one piece from the nearest row. He held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the dryness of it, the smooth ends where the grain had been split clean. Then he went to the stove, opened the door, and placed it inside. He stood there and watched the fire take it. Nobody said anything. Agnes had her eyes closed and may have been asleep. Toby was looking at the wall. Hazel sat on the wooden crate and watched Cornelius watch the fire, and she recognized what she was looking at, a man making a gesture that was not a performance and not an apology and not a speech, but something that said exactly what it needed to say in the only language available to people who have run out of adequate words. In the small hours of the following morning, Dorothea opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling of the dugout for a long time without speaking, the way a person looks at a new place when they are trying to understand where they are before they try to understand anything else. The ceiling was low and timber-framed, and the lamp hanging from a hook cast a warm circle that did not quite reach the corners. She could feel warmth on the left side of her face from the stove. She could feel the weight of the wool blankets and the stone bottles still holding some residual heat against her sides. Agnes's hand was around hers. She turned her head and found Agnes asleep in a chair that had been placed beside her, the small Bible fallen open on her lap, her head tipped to one side. Dorothea looked at her for a long time. She thought about the morning she had stood at the gate in October and spoken to Agnes in the voice she used when she needed to preserve a boundary without appearing to enforce one. She remembered the specific quality of Agnes's silence in response, not the silence of someone who had been hurt, but the silence of someone who had chosen in that moment not to teach the lesson that the moment called for. She turned her head the other way. Hazel was awake, sitting across the stove, watching her with the steady and non-intrusive attention of someone checking a patient's status without performing concern. How long? Dorothea said. Her voice was rough and thin. 3 days. You came in last night. Dorothea closed her eyes and then opened them again. Cornelius. He's here. He's sleeping. She heard his breathing, then somewhere behind her, the slow and heavy breath of a man who has been awake for a very long time and has finally given out. Is he all right? Cold, exhausted. He'll be sore for a week, but yes. Dorothea turned back to the ceiling. A long silence passed between them, the kind that had nothing uncomfortable in it, that was simply two people existing in the same space without the need to fill it. I wrote something, Dorothea said, on the table before. I saw it. Did you read it? The first sentence. Another silence. Then Dorothea said, I've been writing for 20 years, for other people to read. I've written about how to arrange a parlor and how to receive guests and how to maintain standards in difficult circumstances. She paused. I didn't know what difficult circumstances were. Hazel looked at the fire. Most people don't, she said, until they do. What made you know before this? Hazel was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice did not change in tone or pace, but there was something in it that had not been in the earlier conversations she had had with anyone in this room, a willingness to let the thing be said plainly without armor. My father, she said, February of '62. He went out in a storm to get more firewood. He didn't come back. We found him the next morning 70 steps from the door. Dorothea did not say she was sorry, People who have been close to their own death understand that sorry is not the right word for certain kinds of loss. He didn't have a rope, she said. No, he didn't have a rope, and he didn't have a hole in the ground to come back to. Hazel looked at her. The hole is not about fear, Mrs. Aldgate. People think it's about fear. It's about the people you want to come back to. It's about making sure there is somewhere worth coming back to. Dorothea was quiet for a long time after that. When her eyes closed again, it was not from cold or unconsciousness. It was from the weight of understanding something that had been working its way toward her since the previous October and had now arrived. On the sixth day, the wind stopped. It did not taper off. It simply ended between one moment and the next, and the silence it left was so complete and so sudden that all 5 people in the dugout woke at approximately the same moment and lay still listening to it. The low, sustained hum that had been the background of everything for 6 days was gone. In its place was a quiet so absolute it felt like a new kind of sound. Hazel was on her feet first. She climbed the stairs and put her hands on the trap door and pushed. It did not move. She pushed again harder and felt the resistance above. Not the latch which she had already opened, but the weight of accumulated snow that had drifted in through the damaged sections of the cabin above and settled over the trap door while they were below. She came back down. Snow on the door, she said. We go out through the first floor window on the east side. It faces away from the drift direction. It took her and Toby the better part of an hour to clear the window and work their way out, pushing snow back and packing it to the sides, creating a passage through which a person could move. Cornelius worked behind them, passing tools and holding the lamp and doing what was asked of him without comment or complaint, with the focused attention of a man who has recalibrated what usefulness looks like. Agnes stayed below with Dorothea, who was sitting up and had eaten a cup of heated broth and was capable of making her opinion about the situation known, which she did briefly and with some humor, observing that she had spent her adult life writing about the frontier and had not expected to exit it through a window in the snow. When Hazel finally pulled herself through the window and stood upright on the surface of the accumulated drift, the world that met her was one that had no direct predecessor in her experience. The valley of Millhaven had ceased to be a valley in any recognizable sense. The landmarks, the road, the fence lines, the outbuildings, the church steeple that could normally be seen from the rise on Blackwood Road, all of it was gone beneath a uniform and blinding white that extended to the base of the mountains in every direction. The sky above was a specific pale blue of a system that has spent everything it had and is now simply empty. She stood on top of her own buried cabin in the middle of a white silence and looked at it all for a long time. Toby came up beside her. He looked around in the way she had seen him look at things all summer, with the patient taking in of a person building an accurate picture rather than a convenient one. After a while, he said, I don't know where the road is. Neither do I, she said. That's all right, it's still there. Behind them, Cornelius emerged from the window and stood in the snow and looked toward where his house should have been. The roof line was visible, just barely a dark horizontal line above the white. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. The sound of horses came in the early afternoon. It came from the south, where the main road into Millhaven ran down from the pass, and it was followed by voices and then by the sight of 4 riders picking their way through the deep snow at a careful walk, their horses' chests breaking through the crust with each step. They were the county rescue contingent organized out of the territorial marshal's office in Helena, and they had been moving through the valley since dawn, checking properties. Ward Gilpin was one of the 4. He was wrapped in a bearskin coat that had served him through 20 Montana winters, and he sat his horse with the ease of a man who had spent more of his life in a saddle than out of one. When he saw the group standing on top of the drift above Hazel's cabin, 5 people upright and moving, he pulled up his horse and sat there for a moment without dismounting. He looked at them. He looked at the half-buried cabin below them. He looked at the Aldgate house whose roofline was the only part still visible, and at the shattered remnants of the plate glass windows on the east side where the ice inside had expanded and pushed out through the frames overnight. He dismounted. He walked through the snow toward Hazel with the careful, deliberate step of a man crossing uncertain ground, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her face for a longing, if checking for damage that might not be externally visible. 5 of you, he said. 5 of us. From next door, too. He looked again at the Aldgate house. All from the dugout. Yes. Ward took off his hat. He turned it in his hands once looking at the ground. When he looked back up, there was something in his expression that she had not seen on him before in 8 months of knowing him, a quality of being genuinely unsure where to put what he was feeling, of finding himself at the outer edge of the categories he normally used for things. I have been telling people for 30 years, he said, that a tarp and a stack of wood is all a person needs for a Montana winter. He paused. I believed it. I said it to you and I meant it. I know you did. I was wrong. He said it with the plainness of a man who has reached a conclusion through evidence and has no investment in being right about it. I'd like to see it if you're willing. The dugout. I'd like to see what you built. She looked at him for a moment, then she turned and led him back to the window. The medical assessment happened at the edge of the drifts where the rescue team had set up a field station with blankets and hot water, and the particular organized calm of people who do this work regularly. The medic examined Dorothea with care and declared her in fragile but not critical condition, her extremities having recovered adequate circulation, her pulse and breathing normal. He recommended rest and warmth and no exertion for at least 2 weeks. Agnes was declared remarkably sound for a woman of 65 who had spent 6 days underground. Toby's hands had some superficial cold damage that would heal. Cornelius had a deep cough that the medic noted with concern and told him to have a physician examine when the roads opened. Cornelius was standing at the edge of the rescue station when Hazel came back from showing Ward the dugout. He had a tin cup of hot water in his hands, and he was looking at the ground in front of him with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing something and is not certain the rehearsal has prepared him adequately. He heard her approaching and looked up. Mrs. Voss, he said. He stopped. He looked at the cup in his hands and then set it down carefully in the snow beside him. I owe you my wife's life. I owe you mine. He paused. I want you to know that I understand the full weight of that. She stood in front of him and let him say it. I was a fool, he said. Not once. Not just the legal complaint or the jokes at the fence. I was a fool about all of it from the first day, and I made sure everyone around me knew it. He looked down. I don't have words that are adequate to what you did last night. You don't need adequate words, she said. He looked at her. You came to the window, she said. That was the hardest part. Everything after that was just work. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder, the way she had once seen Colonel Hewitt put his hand on the shoulder of a young officer who had made a serious error and survived it and was standing at the beginning of being a different kind of person. Not forgiveness exactly, more like acknowledgement. You are here. That is the beginning of what comes next. She took her hand away. Go be with your wife, she said. He nodded. He turned and walked back toward the rescue station, and she watched him go. And when he reached Dorothea's side and sat down next to her, and she put her hand in his, Hazel looked away. Toby appeared at her elbow. He had his hat in his hands, and he was turning it the way Ward had turned his hat, which she suspected was a habit shared by men who were working up to saying something. "I'm not going back," he said, "to work for Mr. Aldgate." "I know. Do you need someone for the spring work and through the summer?" She looked at him. He was 19 years old with reddened hands and a coat that was too thin for the temperature and the particular quality of steadiness that she had been watching develop all summer. The steadiness of someone who learns from things and does not require that what he learns be comfortable. "The pay is poor," she said. "I don't have expensive habits. The work is hard. I grew up on a farm." She put her hat back on her head. "I'll need help with the expansion in March. I'm planning to add 6 feet to the east wall and a second wood rack." "I know how you want the east wall done," he said. "You told me in September." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she walked back toward the cabin. "Come on then," she said. "Let's see what the storm left us." The spring arrived in stages, as it always did, the warmth working its way up from the valley floor, while the upper slopes held their white for weeks after the lower ground had turned to mud and then to green. By the end of March, the roads were passable. By mid-April, the last of the drifts had pulled away from the north-facing walls and the ground was soft enough to work. Ward Gilpin's hardware store on the main street of Millhaven saw a particular kind of customer that spring that he had not seen in such numbers before, people from the outlying farms and the newer properties in town asking about vapor barriers and cedar post stock and cast iron stoves. Some of them mentioned the winter. Some of them did not need to. He helped each one without comment, and when they asked questions he did not know the answer to, which happened more often than it had the previous year, he told them honestly that Mrs. Voss on Blackwood Road could answer better than he could, and he gave them directions. He did not use the name Mole Woman. He simply said Voss, and they knew who he meant. Agnes Moorfield planted a small border of mountain aster along the front fence of her property in late April. She chose the location carefully. It was the spot on the path where Toby Crane had gone down on his hands and knees onto the ice and begun crawling toward her through the freezing rain. She did not explain this to anyone. She did not need to explain it to anyone. She went out each morning and looked at the new growth for a moment before going inside to make her coffee, and the Harper family memory that had sat in her chest for 22 years was still there, as it would always be there. But it had shifted in some way she could not entirely describe, had become something she could look at directly, rather than something she had to carry with her, eyes averted. The Aldgate house was rebuilt through May and June with modifications that made its third summer in Millhaven look considerably different from its first. The plate glass gave way to smaller, double-framed windows. The plaster walls came down and were replaced with interior log facing over thick insulation of packed sawdust and wool batting. The coal shed was repositioned to the south side of the property with a proper roof and a door that faced east, away from the direction of every hard wind the valley had produced in 20 years of recorded observation. The central heating furnace was retained but supplemented by a secondary system, a wood stove in the kitchen, a small parlor stove on the second floor, both connected to their own independent flues. And in the space beneath the rebuilt back porch, accessed by a trap door set into the porch floor, there was a room. It was not as large as Hazel's. It was not as expertly finished. The cedar posts were slightly uneven, and the clay floor had a low section in the northwest corner that collected water when it rained and required a shallow drainage channel cut with a chisel and a mallet. But it was dry and it was deep, and along the east wall there was a rack of white oak and ash that Cornelius Aldgate had begun splitting in March and had continued splitting every Saturday morning through April and into May. The sound of the maul carrying across the fence to where Hazel and Toby were working on the expansion of her own east wall. He did not ask her for advice. He had watched and listened for 6 days in a room 12 feet underground, and he had come back up with what he needed: Some things do not require instruction once you have understood the reason for them. Dorothea did not submit another piece to the Philadelphia Ladies Gazette that spring. She wrote because she was a person who thought through writing and always had been, but what she wrote went into a wooden box in the drawer of her writing table and stayed there. The box held the torn pages of the original Millhaven piece, the sheet with the unfinished question from February, and a growing collection of new pages, careful and unhurried, exploring ideas that she did not yet have conclusions for. The last page she added that spring in May ended with a sentence she had been working toward for months. She wrote it and read it back and did not change a word. Civilization is not what you build. It is what remains when everything you built is gone. She was not certain it was true in every case. She was certain it was true in hers. On a Thursday afternoon in late May, Hazel sat on the back step of her cabin with a cup of coffee and watched the valley in the way she had learned to watch the mountains in Wyoming, with no particular object in view, taking in the whole of it without fixing on any one part. The aspens were leafing out along the lower creek, and the sky above the western peaks was the clean and uncomplicated blue of a system that has spent its violence and returned to its original nature. From the other side of the fence came the regular sound of a maul striking wood. Cornelius in the yard working through the last of his spring pile. From inside her own storage room came the intermittent sound of Toby fitting the new timber framing for the east wall extension. Agnes's front gate, visible from the step, had the small purple flowers of mountain aster nodding at its base in whatever breeze was moving through the valley. Hazel drank her coffee and looked at all of it. She thought about the February morning when the barometer had moved in a way she had never seen it move before, and about the 6 days that followed, and about the 70 steps she had made twice in wind that reduced the world to 3 feet of visibility and cold that had no interest in what she wanted. She thought about her father and the 70 steps he had walked in the wrong direction. She thought about Ezra Whitmore, who had buried a tin box under the floor of a house he was leaving and written his one message to the future inside it. Dig deeper than you think you need. She had done that. In October, she had gone 18 inches deeper than her plan called for in the lamplight of a half-finished room, because a man who had been dead for 15 years had told her to. And those 18 inches had held one more person. They had held Agnes Moorfield, who had spent 22 years carrying a memory that had now changed its weight, and who had planted flowers at the place where a 19-year-old from Iowa had crawled across the ice in the freezing rain to reach her. The sound of the maul across the fence continued steady and unhurried, one blow and then another. Hazel set her coffee cup down on the step beside her. She looked at the barometer through the open kitchen door. The needle was still. It had been still for 3 months, pointing to the same fixed point on the dial, the point that meant nothing is coming that you do not have time to prepare for. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee and went back inside. The afternoon was warm. The work was waiting. There was more to do before winter. There was always more to do before winter. That was not a threat. That was simply the nature of living in a place honestly with your eyes open, taking it for what it was rather than what you needed it to be. The earth did not change its nature to accommodate what you had invested in it. But if you were willing to go down into it, if you were willing to do the slow and patient work of making a place in the deep where the cold could not reach it, offered something that no amount of plate glass or distribution pipe or $500 machinery could replicate. It offered the simple fact of still being there in the spring. The aspens were leafing out. The barometer needle was still. Somewhere in the valley, a meadowlark was trying out the first notes of a song it had been keeping to itself all winter. Hazel Voss listened to it and drank her coffee and was content.